And there's Brett. God, I can smell his privilege from across the room.
I beg your misogynistic pardon? I'm so over the toxic masculinity in this hallway right now.
The more you think about activist characters in the media, the more you start to see this pattern crop up. These clips of Veronica in Riverdale are not just a cringe example of adult writers trying to vibe with Gen Z's slang and sentiment. It's lines given to a character who embodies luxury and privilege. She's the ultimate embodiment of wokeness as many people now perceive it. Although the word ultimately refers to an awareness of important issues, especially those associated with social justice, the negative association with a particular kind of out-of-touch whining means that being woke is increasingly seen as a joke. This idea of wokeness is just the latest iteration in a long line of different ways of portraying activism on screen. Woke characters are a reflection of the strawman image of activists popularized to discredit legitimate justice movements. These characters combine a range of negative traits to portray activists as ineffectual, irritating, delusional killjoys, the effect being a character we can laugh at, in turn giving the audience permission to laugh at the cause they support or the concept of supporting a cause at all. The annoying or out-of-touch activist trope is everywhere. Just in the last year, we've had Alana in Dear Evan Hansen, an overachiever using the suicide of a fellow student to create a fundraising group to reopen an orchard or something, I guess. And even more recently, The Fallout gives us Nick, a character who seems excited to become an anti-school shooting advocate in the public spotlight, while seemingly not really caring about how the event seriously affected his friend and the people around him. Even characters who have quickly become fan favourites, like Lily in The Princess Diaries, are clearly portrayed in their stories as bad friends for the way that they prioritise social and environmental justice. The implication is that real friends support each other. They don't call each other out or criticise their morals. Lily telling Mia her designer bag is worth enough to feed hundreds of people in need is portrayed in the movie like an act of pointed bullying rather than genuine concern for inequality. Lily literally has a show called Shut Up and Listen. It's the quintessential image of the bullheaded, self-righteous activist. A lot of people liked the character, maybe seeing the good in her intentions beyond the way the movie attempted to present her, but the intentions of the movie were clearly still there. On this channel, we talk a lot about how the representation of communities and experiences in media can affect the way that real people are viewed and treated. And so today I want to dig into the way that fictional portrayals of activism are in conversation and have in some ways shaped the angry, blue-haired, SJW, woke snowflake activist image of today. This trend can be seen across pretty much all types of activism, but because it's my sort of specialist area of knowledge, I'm going to be doing kind of a case study deep dive into LGBTQ+ activism on screen to see what it can tell us about this infuriating trend. The real LGBTQ+ activism. Queer activism has a long history. Many people attribute the Stonewall riots in 1969 as the start of the gay liberation movement, at least in the West. But there had been protests of various kinds for years before then. Stonewall was sort of the perfect storm moment to turn what might have been just another street fight with police into something with lasting significance. It was unplanned and spontaneous, but caught the attention of gay media at the time to amplify news of the riot and ended up inspiring activism not just across the US, but in other countries around the world. LGBTQ+ activism had and still has very legitimate causes to fight for. In the last 60 years, not even a full lifetime, we've seen fights for decriminalization, marriage equality, family and adoption rights, next of kin rights, anti-discrimination legislation, age of consent equality, and much more. This isn't even looking at fighting social homophobia, but just literal laws, which meant that I grew up assuming that I'd be living the rest of my life as a second-class citizen without the same rights as the straight peers around me. And that feels like a pretty rich well to draw inspiring, complex, and interesting characters from, right? Well, first of all, this whole thing where, being gay was literally illegal, alongside censorship policies like the Hays Code, meant the representation of queer activism has not been in place since the beginning of cinema. The same year as the Stonewall riots, a documentary called We Who Have Friends was made in the UK. It had been 2 years since the 1967 Reform Act that decriminalised homosexuality, and interviews included people who thought that gayness needed to be cured and that discussing it publicly would be utterly distasteful.
They immediately stand to lose a great deal of respect and business and their livelihood and their friends and so forth.
How would you react if you discovered that one of your friends you've known for a long time was homosexual?
I don't know. I think I might go off him, actually. I don't... My outlook on him would be different.
Yes, I'm afraid I'm the old school there,
Yeah.
and I think that it's a pretty revolting sort of thing.
They were talking heads, which did include some positive responses, but they were often peppered with well-meaning ignorance, like this guy who talks about how he's okay with the mixing of homosexuals and normal people. In the end, after a well-publicised search, only one gay man came forward to be interviewed for the documentary publicly. I think we can see the same dismissal of wokeness and real-life activism reflected in the treatment of justice movements in the mainstream press over the years. News reports at the time of social change and upheaval, of the striking down of unjust laws or pushes to change public opinion and ideas of equality, were often reactionary. People that are now heralded as heroes were written about with disdain at the time. In archive footage of early documentaries, we see queer people's very existence sequestered away in their own private bars to be a source of derision, let alone those fighting for equality.
For many of us, this is revolting. Men dancing with men. Homosexuals in this country today break the law.
Is it any wonder that people nod and laugh along to the exaggerated portrayal of activism in fictional works when we're fed the imagery of the extreme activist by supposedly unbiased news media? This isn't relegated to the past. Just look at the way that trans people are spoken about today. People like Paris Lees or Juno Dawson are called trans activists just for existing as trans women in the public eye. Trans people, especially in mainstream UK media right now, are painted as inherently dangerous, mentally ill, harmful to children, very reminiscent of previous arguments against gay people. And that's just for being visible. Trans people who are actually activists themselves, trying to spread information, addressing crowds at protests, pushing for equality in their communities, are targeted with even more ferocity. Early portrayals of LGBTQ+ activists were noticeably void of LGBTQ+ people themselves, with public opinion on gay rights still depressingly negative in the 2000s, when public polls would often show overwhelming support against equality measures. Perhaps this shouldn't be surprising. In We Who Have Friends, interviewees for gay equality included Leo Absey, the straight Welsh MP who had introduced the Reform Act itself, and Peter Manolt, a presumably straight man who was the editor of a bisexual and gay magazine called Jeremy. He refers to gay people as them a lot, separate to himself, and also hoped that it would be appealing to everybody in the way that included basically just a lot of naked, hot models of all genders. Interestingly, they include footage of a nude photo shoot in the movie with a naked man who very deliberately goes to the side of the set when they cut to kiss his wife and child who happen to be there, kind of to emphasize, like, yeah, I'm modeling for this gay magazine, but I'm not gay. And so we can understand that the idea that showing interest in LGBTQ+ equality might sound better coming from a straight cis character. If the purpose was to change minds, at least, having a socially homophobic audience able to connect with a character without judgment before they revealed their passion for equality would be more impactful than introducing a queer character with the same ideas. For decades, LGBTQ+ people were seen as too controversial or divisive to be portrayed at all. And if we were too controversial to even be seen, can you imagine how hard it would be to sell queer activism? Even in the last few years, we've seen an array of examples of queer characters in kids' media which have had their explicit confirmation of that queerness removed or erased, so not exactly a recipe for teaching kids about LGBTQ+ existence, let alone activism or equality. We see multiple examples of this in the work of Aaron Sorkin. For the most part, Sorkin supports the gay agenda. He just doesn't really write many gay characters, and when he does, they're often pro-life Republicans who vote against their own interests. Gay rights are brought up multiple times throughout Sorkin's work, especially in The West Wing and The Newsroom. However, neither of those shows have any gay main characters. Instead, what we'll have is a good straight person arguing on behalf of gay people, a kind of righteous hetero, if you will. There's the famous President Bartlett scene.
I don't say homosexuality is an abomination, Mr. President. The Bible does.
Yes, it does. Leviticus
18:22.
chapter and verse. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions while I had you here. I'm interested in selling my youngest daughter into slavery as sanctioned in Exodus 21:7. She's a Georgetown sophomore, speaks fluent Italian, always cleared the table when it was her turn. What would a good price for her be?
Sam Seaborn, advocating against Don't Ask, Don't Tell.
A lot of those cases you're talking about of the gays being discharged came from voluntary statements.
And a lot of these are not voluntary statements, not by any definition given by any civilian court in this country. It is not a voluntary statement when it's given to a psychotherapist, as in the case of former Marine Corporal David Blessing. It is not a voluntary statement when it's made in a personal diary, as in the case of former West Point cadet Nicole Garrison.
Will McAvoy shaming a Republican presidential candidate for not defending gay soldiers.
That was a big room full of Republican primary voters booing an American combat soldier who, as he was speaking, was in combat. The audience members who were booing were in Orlando. Soon they'll surely be in hell.
These characters often make thoughtful, well-researched arguments for queer rights, but it's not clear if any of these characters even know a queer person themselves. I think that genuine passion that comes from these kind of characters is often read as like a kind of moral justness, whereas the same sort of passion coming from queer people themselves would be seen as aggressive, too much. The inverse to this trope is the apolitical queer. Compare The West Wing, which ran from 1999 to 2006, and Will and Grace, which ran basically the same years. As I mentioned, West Wing had no regular or recurring gay characters, but just a few single episode gays. Will and Grace, on the other hand, obviously had plenty, especially gay men. But The West Wing explicitly tackles queer political issues, while Will and Grace kind of just doesn't. They do talk about gay marriage a little bit and make passing jokes about some queer issues, but that's kind of it. And yeah, you can attribute that to the fact that The West Wing was a political drama and Will and Grace was a sitcom, but it's also because Will and Grace was under a level of scrutiny that The West Wing never faced. Will and Grace premiered a year after Ellen was cancelled, largely because of Ellen the person and Ellen the character coming out and the show becoming too gay. When Will and Grace premiered, critics were hypersensitive to any sort of implication that this was the gay agenda. While the pilot episode was well received, in part because the show wasn't too gay, the Philadelphia Inquirer expressed relief that the show was about friendship, not the gay lifestyle. It feels like the mainstream has always been looking out for this idea of wokeness, just not using that particular word. Having gay characters this time was inherently political. Anything more would be asking for too much. In 194 episodes, the show mentions HIV once when Grace and her boyfriend get tested. Will and Jack have been dating since the 80s and it just is not a concern, apparently. And there is value in that, in providing queer audiences representation and escapism. It also helps straight audiences see gay people as not inherently tragic or reduced to their sex lives. In 2012, the then Vice President Joe Biden said Will and Grace probably did more to educate the American public than almost anything anybody's ever done so far. And while I think that that statement definitely, minimizes real-life queer activists in America, he's not entirely wrong. At its peak, Will and Grace had more than 16 million views each episode. It was the most mainstream positive depiction of queer men during a hugely political and polarizing time for the gay community. But that apolitical gay trope didn't end in the 90s. Modern Family's Cam and Mitchell are a great example of anti-political characters in contemporary television. In one episode, they revealed that they actually leave town during Pride because they don't like the traffic. While the show portrays Cam and Mitchell adopting and getting married, they never really talk about Cam and Mitchell having to fight for their right to get married or adopt in the first place, even though it would have been literally illegal for them to do it just a few years prior. The aesthetic of activism. We all know what activism looks like, right? It's shouting at crowds with a megaphone and DIY printed posters and zines and pin badges with cool slogans. At least that's the aesthetic of activism, and an easy shorthand to make an audience think something radical is happening. But a lot of the time, real activism is totally removed from this aesthetic. At best, it gives a false impression of the reality of activism to an audience. At worst, it's used to further the idea that activism is a shallow or surface-level interest for out-of-touch complainers. It's all fluff. It's all looks and pageantry. So a pretty famous example of this aesthetic with little substance would be Rent. It feels like it should be like a queer activist movie musical, and some people even remember it in their heads as being a queer activist movie musical when they think back on it, but it's really not. Rent is set in the East Village in New York during the late 1980s and early 1990s. The East Village, alongside Greenwich Village and NoHo, were basically the epicenter of the AIDS epidemic in the States, and they were also the epicenter of AIDS activism. And here is the AIDS activism in Rent.
Actual reality, act up, fight it!
Now, that isn't to say that all media should be giving us activism at its centre, but the movie does its best to give us like the aesthetic of activism, and then has the self-obsessed Maureen as the only activist character through this kind of self-indulgent performance art. There are plenty of HIV positive characters in Rent, but their suffering is specifically apolitical. Look, watch Lindsay Ellis's video for the full breakdown, but basically, there's no discussion of healthcare or medical discrimination. Roger and Mimi have easy access to AZT and seem to have no side effects from it. And Rent seems to misrepresent queer history to the point of outright erasure. And I guess since we're talking about Larson, we should probably talk about Tick, Tick, Boom. In the marketing of this movie, the AIDS epidemic is heavily emphasized. In the trailer, Andrew Garfield cycles past the pink triangle silence equals death posters saying he's been to 3 friends' funerals that year and nobody is doing enough. I'm not doing enough. Then his agent says, write about what you know. And Andrew Garfield bursts into song belting, what's it gonna take to wake up a generation? Based on that clip, what do you think this movie is about? Maybe it's the story of an artist who starts to raise awareness about anti-AIDS policies or campaigns for comprehensive sex education. Tick, Tick, Boom is not about AIDS activism. Again, it borrows the aesthetic of AIDS activism without depicting any actual activism itself. In the movie, Larson has one friend die of AIDS and another character receives a positive diagnosis, but those storylines only serve to heighten Larson's personal journey with committing to his musical theatre career. It's not a political awakening, it's an artistic one. The marketing sort of, queer activists baited us there. But Rowan, I hear you cry. Sorkin and Will and Grace were creatures of the 90s and the 2000s. Surely we have left activism as aesthetic in the past, alongside low-rise jeans and frosted tips. And to that I say, we should probably talk about Moxie. This movie marketed itself as a kind of intersectional feminist activist teen movie, where a bunch of girls band together and protest the sexist treatment by boys in their school and the school system as a whole. This movie really feels like an adult's impression of what teenagers nowadays care about, but it comes just too late. It's really interesting watching teenagers' reactions to this movie and how it all just seems a bit basic to them, like stuff they already know and they already care about, they've already been working on. The protagonist of Moxie is Vivian, a sophomore who's trying to survive high school by keeping her head down. Vivian's school is horrifyingly yet relatively sexist. The girls' soccer team doesn't get any funding, there's a no tank top dress code that's only enforced on curvier girls, the school administration turns a blind eye to sexual harassment. There's this one student in particular, Mitchell, who regularly harasses girls and actively participates in this tradition where a few boys give all the girls derogatory epithets like most bangable, best rack, stuff like that. The inciting incident of the movie is the arrival of Lucy. When Mitchell harasses her, she stands up for herself. Lucy is the catalyst for Vivian diving into her mum's old feminist activist materials. Vivian then becomes the anonymous leader of this kind of feminist uprising in the school, instructing other girls to draw stars and hearts on their hands to show support, to protest the school dress code by wearing tank tops, and to put I'm an arsehole stickers on Mitchell's locker. When you put Vivian and Lucy next to each other, it becomes really confusing as to why Vivian is the one leading this movement. Lucy is the first to call out Mitchell and the school for its sexist behaviour. Lucy is the one who already reads scenes. Lucy organises the first Moxie meeting. Lucy nominates a female student for a scholarship typically given to men. Lucy is objectively a much better activist and central character than Vivian. But Vivian becomes the leader and makes all of the important decisions. She's also way more developed as a character. She's given a full romantic arc with a boy, a conflict with her mother, the whole protagonist package. Lucy gets 2 kisses with a girl during a party and it's never addressed again. Lucy never doubts herself. Lucy always knows the right activist answer. Honestly, she's less of a character and more like an updated activist version of the black best friend trope. And Lucy isn't the only queer person Moxie doesn't know how to handle. There's a trans student whose teachers keep dead naming her, and yeah, that's her arc. Her entire narrative role is experiencing transphobia and telling a cis person about it. There's a lot of issues with how Moxie depicts its queer and POC characters. Like a whole other video essay worth of problems, I'm sure someone's already made it. But for now, I feel like a lot of people's issues with this movie are best summed up by its ending. In the last scene of the movie, Vivian leads a walkout in support of an anonymous rape victim. Vivian reveals herself as Moxie, gives this speech, and then the head cheerleader reveals herself as the rape victim and gives a speech too, and then Lucy goes up to make her speech and...
Yeah, and y'all need to stop touching our hair, okay? All right. Now that everyone is aware of how much we have a lot...
Music plays over her, the camera cuts to Vivian making out with her boyfriend. Moxie wants to show you a black queer activist, but they don't want you to listen to her. This kind of feels like a modern continuation of that trope that I talked about earlier, right? Where non-LGBTQ plus people are the ones used as a mouthpiece for LGBTQ plus issues in a time when they were more acceptable to be listened to. Vivian, being the straight white cis girl that she is, might be woke, but she's not too woke. If earlier movies like Rent use the aesthetic of queer activism, then Moxie creates the aesthetic of intersectional activism without actually depicting it in a meaningful way. Instead, it uses its BIPOC, queer, and disabled characters as background for a pretty tame white feminist story. Like, to be clear, Moxie is a very sweet movie, but in terms of its portrayal of activism, it feels very pointed about who it allows to grab the microphone and actually tell their story and their point of view. And this is significant, right? Because this movie isn't itself anti-woke. Like, this is a movie that specifically is trying to be about activism, and it seems to be in support of that activism. But even then, it still feels the need to place this protagonist at the center who only deviates from that kind of straight white male norm by 1 degree. The butt of the joke. I think one of the key nuances of the activists are extreme trope is that they're also ineffective in their actual goals. The joke comes from the gap between their delusional mission and the supposed reality around them. Their exaggerated black and white morality causes more upset than the actual issue that they claim to care about. Enid, in both the film Legally Blonde and its musical adaptation, is a kind of straw feminist who finds problems where there aren't any. In the movie, Enid introduces herself as a Berkeley Women's Study graduate who led a Lesbians Against Drunk Driving protest. Later, she campaigns to change the word semester to ovmester because semester shows a preference to semen. In the musical, Enid's activism is comical because of how excessive it is. She didn't just inoculate refugees in the Peace Corps, she single-handedly built family clinics, saved endangered species, cleaned up the water supply, protested insensitive cartoons. She's also going to really stick it to the phallus of the war machine. Enid is pretty much a standard man-hating lesbian caricature. But what sets her apart is how she's used in what many have reclaimed as a feminist movie. The movie simultaneously mocks Enid's activism while praising Elle's journey of female empowerment. It's straw feminism versus girl power. And while a lot of real-life feminists love Elle Woods, it's interesting to note that Elle herself never identifies with feminism or the feminist movement in the movie. Legally Blonde is a great story about personal empowerment, but not necessarily about socioeconomic empowerment. So this is the part of the video where we talk a little bit about today's sponsor, ThreadUp. So I've talked a few times on this channel about the idea that there isn't just one way that you can help support a cause that you care about. There will normally be a whole menu you can choose from, including like protesting, donating, and also making very deliberate choices with things that you do every day, like shopping. And that is where ThreadUp might come in. So ThreadUp is an online thrift store looking to make secondhand clothes shopping and sustainable choices as easy as possible for everyone involved. I buy a lot of my clothes secondhand, but I'd never done it online before, so I wanted to give ThreadUp a try. It was a lot easier to find what I wanted compared to like rummaging through shelves in various charity shops. The first piece I got was this dress from Karen Stevens. I've been wearing it with this little cardigan that I already own, and also with my mum's belt from the 80s, because again, we love to reuse. I then saw this top from American Eagle and was like, this is the perfect D&D cosplay top, let's go. So I've kind of tried to make a little pirate outfit here, with like a belt and an apron, a skirt and a little pirate hat. I think I'm pulling it off pretty well. I'm also strongly of the opinion that leopard print is a neutral, and currently I only own one leopard print skirt and that's it. So this dress was really calling to me from Almost Famous. I've just added here a little bit of gold jewelry and some black boots to just set off the vibe, you know what I mean? I was also looking for something to thrift that I could wear across seasons. So originally I was just gonna wear this jumper like over dresses, but I realized it was long enough to tie into like a cropped top vibe with jeans. So I've also been trying that out. That cardigan was from Audrey 3+1. And finally, this absolute chef's kiss item, this dress. I know nothing about fashion, so I may be pronouncing the brand wrong, Sachin and Babby. Oh my god, I have been obsessed with like the puff sleeve stuff, but I feel like a lot of them are very like spring and summer, and I really wanted something I could wear like autumn, winter when it's colder. The colors in this, absolutely perfect. So I saved money on all the items that I thrifted, but the biggest difference with this cardigan, which was originally $60 and cost me $9.99, and possibly my favorite item, which is the dress that costs just under $66 and was down from $495. You can try it out yourself and get 30% off your first order and free shipping when you use the code ROWAN. I will leave a link in the description. We're just like you. In stories where we only have one activist, this can become an exercise in look how disruptive and extreme and over the top this queer person is. Isn't this nice, happy, reasonable queer person better? The gay agenda has long been a talking point around queer activism, an accusation of spreading gayness by bringing up issues of equality. It was kind of the woke buzzword before woke was used. When even being openly ourselves was seen as radical and dangerous, it's perhaps understandable that we might see characters who model themselves on assimilating and blending in with straightness, projecting the unthreatening "we're just like you" message in comparison to more outspoken counterparts. One of the earliest examples I remember seeing of this kind of criticism of unapologetic queerness was Lionel in United States of Tara. I distinctly remember this brash, openly gay teen starting the school LGBT advocacy group who was reprimanded by one of the main characters, Marshall, on behalf of the audience with this speech. "You ruin it for gay people, Lionel. You make being gay something no one would ever want to be. It's like you're asking for it." There's this sense that people who point out inequality or injustice are seeing things that aren't there, that they're embarrassing the good minorities who just want to be nice and normal. With these outspoken activist foils, their personality outside of their activism is often abrasive, reflecting back on what an activist acts and looks like to further invalidate the activism in the narrative. This person is just naturally angry and annoying, and their activism is a part of that. You see this in coming out narratives, which lead immediately to the message, "He's gay, but that's not the most important thing about him." A very unobtrusive, softly character who doesn't point to the continuing injustices in our world. In this type of story, activism would upset this sexuality blindness. The confidence in knowing yourself, a positive aspect of coming out narratives, is twisted to a point where confidence, pride you could even say, is seen as arrogance, not a respectable trait at all. Like this Key and Peele sketch from 2013, which is pretty similar to the Little Britain only gay in the village bit from nearly a decade prior to that.
Oh, I get it. You don't like my music because I'm gay. You can't handle a gay man's music.
No. I'm trying to work here.
With an effeminate, over-the-top gay man getting unduly offended for no real reason.
Oh, I get it. I'm not persecuted. I'm just an ass.
Because his oppression is something made up in his head, obsessed as he is with being a victim. They accuse people of homophobia for the smallest and most insignificant of things and encourage us to laugh at this oblivious wokeness. We can see this tactic of respectability all the way back in 1974 in this television short produced by the London group of the Campaign for Homosexual Equality.
Has a membership of 4,000 women and men who never go near the law courts, never get mentioned in the press, who bear no resemblance to the collar and tie woman or to the limp-wristed queen.
Drawing clear distinctions between themselves and the wrong sort of queer person seeking equality. We're different and that's okay. And then we have the activism that acknowledges difference. We might be queers, but that's okay. These portrayals often carefully toe the line between too ineffectual and too radical. They acknowledge some of the difference between queer people and their straight and cis counterparts, but are quick to reassure that those differences are not too much. This feels like an attitude in direct conversation with the rhetoric around marriage equality in the 2000s, with the talking point gay people used to justify earning their civil rights was all about how normal they were. "We're just like you" was pretty much the baseline message at the time. There is no doubt that the normalization of same-sex relationships had a huge influence over the fight for legal equality and the way it smoothed over public opinion. It was easy to understand because they were just like you. You didn't have to learn any new terms or change larger parts of your view on morality. These were just good old-fashioned, romantic, wholesome gays looking to be productive citizens in their state-sanctioned couples. And to be fair, however glibly I just delivered that sentence, marriage equality was a huge deal. The emotional and psychological impact of seeing people debate your humanity and right to equality on the news every day for years cannot be understated. During this period, perhaps the most well-known and mainstream film about a gay activist was released, Milk. It was a biopic about the life and death of Harvey Milk, the first openly gay man to be elected to public office in California back in the 1970s. Its release coincided with the infamous Prop 8 constitutional amendment bill that would see same-sex marriage in California, which had just been approved in June of 2008, made illegal again for 5 more years. There was a frustrating gap between the pioneering gay activists that the movie was about and the lackluster support for the fight for gay rights happening at that very moment from the studio itself. While queer moviegoers were boycotting the Cinemark chain as its chief exec donated to the campaign to ban same-sex marriage, the studio continued with its plan to show Milk in those theatres. This seems to be a direct display of the gap between the acceptable activists of the past fighting for rights that we now take for granted, compared to the radical activists of the moment who are just a little bit too much. Except that now, in 2022, those radical activists of 2008 asking for marriage equality are, in our eyes, just as acceptable as Milk was at the time. The New York Times described the convergence of Milk, which portrayed gay rights battles of 30 years ago, and a looming new culture war over homosexual marriage and other issues. The idea now that equal marriage was like a war being fought might seem exaggerated to younger members of the community, but it feels like an accurate summation to someone who was there at the time. But there has always been an attitude from some queer people that pushing for sameness, for fitting our lives into the language and experiences of straightness, shouldn't be the end goal. And this, I think, is the key to many ideas of wokeness and LGBTQ+ characters, because it's not just about neutral legal equality. It asks us to look at the foundations of our ideas of gender and sex, relationships and selfhood, and question. And that questioning can very quickly lead to tugging on threads of what we've been told are simple truths to reveal complexity underneath. That uncertainty can be freeing, but can also be troubling. It's a lot easier to dismiss these discussions as wokeness, and those engaging in them as doing too much or making a big deal about things that no one even cares about. Concepts that are just slightly outside of the norm, that require some self-reflection, get lumped in with exaggerated satire. It's this same slippery slope fallacy that had people on national news stations claiming gay people getting married would lead to people getting married to their dogs. If we let someone choose their own name and pronouns, what might they choose next? It's much easier to say, isn't this ridiculous? To tell people, don't worry, I know this is new and confusing and weird, but it's because they're wrong. You don't have to think about this stuff more deeply. You don't have to question your own ideas of gender or sex or relationships, because those people are just going too far. Queer as Folk was a show that aired in the 2000s, right in the middle of that battleground, with states gaining and losing various rights each year. The show centered around a group of gay friends and had an impressive cross-section of activism threaded throughout its seasons, from the escalating violence of the queer vigilante group the Pink Posse to legitimate political canvassing and protest. One of the most interesting scenes of activism at the time was the moment Michael stands on stage about to make a speech to appease the straight and cis community about how we're all the same, and instead he speaks his truth, that we aren't the same, but that's totally fine. He begins, I have a loving partner, 2 wonderful kids, a home, a small business. The truth is, I'm just like you, before putting the script down and continuing. Actually, that's not the truth. Sure, in a lot of ways, I am just like you. I want to be happy. I want some security, a little extra money in my pocket, but in many ways, my life is nothing like yours. Why should it be? Do we all have to have the same lives to have the same rights? In the gay community, we have drag queens, leather daddies, couples with children, every colour of the rainbow. Being different is what makes us all the same. It's what makes us family. The community, his friends, that people might not consider to be respectable enough because they're too different, are just as worthy of support as he is, in his photo-ready family with a husband and 2 kids, especially when it's just a marketable image that looks respectable to the outside. In reality, his husband Ben is HIV positive and affected by the stigma surrounding that diagnosis, and his son Hunter grew up on the street as an underage sex worker. While Michael chose to break from the we're all the same script of his own volition, sometimes an innate sense of difference makes advocacy a necessity for a character. Trevor is a trans character in the show Shameless. His very existence ends up being a form of advocacy. He has to explain being trans to multiple characters and therefore the audience too. He's very open about his identity, with a wary patience clearly born from having to have these conversations too many times before, and a strong sense of self-worth. He's also an advocate for vulnerable youth and is generally a pretty chill guy. Arguably, that chill personality is a deliberate way to balance an unapologetic attitude to his gender. He's clearly portrayed as the one in the right during moments where the lead characters are ignorant or confused. But the show also introduces Trevor's friends in a scene where they go around and share multiple identities and pronouns.
I'm Bethany. I'm a triracial cis. I identify as pansexual and my pronoun is she.
Okay.
and the vibe behind this scene is very different. It seems to now side with the cis gay man Ian, who is uncomfortable and unsure with this group. Not just because of the way they introduce themselves, but also the way that the show positions this group as removed from the reality of Ian's working class life. There's this implicit suggestion that having these multiple identities is something that comes with too much time and privilege on your hands, which is not exactly reflecting the reality where queer people are routinely affected by poverty and homelessness at a greater rate than their cis and straight counterparts, but what are you gonna do? We get an example of a queer activist in a lead rather than a side role in the teenager Elena in the sitcom One Day at a Time. After her dad abandons her during her quinceañera, Elena's LGBTQ+ activism is framed as an outlet for her anger. When her Catholic school allows her to start a GSA, she's upset because she was looking forward to protesting homophobic policies. Activism becomes a catharsis for personal trauma for her. Look, the quinceañera episode is great. It does a really good job of showing the betrayal a queer child can feel when their parent abandons them, but it accidentally presents activism as a misdirected cry for attention. Elena and her partner Sid go out on Halloween to spread awareness of climate change, but nobody takes them seriously, and eventually they decide that trick-or-treating is way more fun. This kind of rhetoric harkens back to those old stereotypes of activists being humorless killjoys. The show has these moments of leaning into the joke of wokeness, with Elena's teenage naivety tied to her activism. But the show also gives us some positives around her activism too. They position her as a voice of morality, reason, and reliable information. It's Elena who tells her family how important it is to participate in the census. It's Elena who encourages her mother to ask for a pay rise. And it's Elena who confronts her brother about his harmful behaviour towards a girl in his class. The show sides with Elena just as often as it teases her, portraying her both as annoying and endearing.
Mansplaining is
It's when a man explains something to a woman that she already knows, but he acts like he's teaching her. Does that make sense?
Many activists find Elena very relatable. It takes time for you to kind of grow into an effective activist. Thanks to icons like, Greta Thunberg and the March for Our Lives leaders, it's easy to forget that activism is a skill that takes time to learn. Elena is clearly at the start of this activist journey, and if the show hadn't been cancelled twice, maybe we could have seen her activism mature alongside her. I think one of the reasons why the character is so popular is that she treads this line really carefully between not being too woke, right, as a joke, as a caricature, but also not being too perfect. There's more realism, more authenticity there. Liberation. So what does it look like to have a character who is actively fighting to dismantle these social structures and is pointing out injustices and is consistently taken seriously for it? For the most part, these characters are firmly cast in historical narratives, stories of real or fictional activists working towards a level of equality we already have today, people whose radical demands are now commonly accepted truths. It almost has to be characters from the past for this very reason. As I said earlier, in 20 years, it'll almost certainly be the types of people who are now being belittled as woke snowflakes who will be the brave activists in movies about what's happening today. Actively fighting structures of oppression and corruption and heteronormativity might be seen as overreactions now, but they're also the cornerstone of many AIDS crisis narratives. I couldn't make this video without talking about the movie Pride. Pride is one of my favourite films of all time. It tells the real-life story of a group of queer activists who raise money for the families of striking miners in the 1980s. We see everything from fundraising to pride marches, picket lines to community raffles. With the activist group Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners dedicating themselves to helping the mining community, even as their own was being ravaged by the AIDS crisis. The movie focuses on the importance of solidarity and justice movements, how the same unjust government and police force was a danger to multiple groups, that taking on a cause didn't mean you ignored others' suffering. It's long been a tired talking point in the community, right? In fact, the first examples of it appeared during the very first parade, whether Pride should be a party or a protest. The final sequence of the movie takes place at a Pride march in London, where the organisers insist that political and fringe groups be made to march either without banners or at the back, essentially arguing that it would ruin the mood to acknowledge any struggles or causes within the community. Far from the film painting the organisers as reasonable and the activists as overly sensitive and attention-seeking, like it kind of feels many movies about contemporary queer issues might do, the film goes out of its way to show activists eventually being asked to lead the march as a just triumph. And the fact that they're joined by hundreds of minors in solidarity is devastating in its joyous emotional gut punch. But however much I do love this movie, there is one glaring issue. Its portrayal of lesbian and feminist activists. For a movie so successful in its portrayal of queer men, and with such strong messages of solidarity, the way it veers towards the crazy feminist stereotypes is sort of bizarre. They're often used as a source of humour, with one memorable scene where they ask about their desire for a women's group to address specific needs of women in LGSM, ending with one of the Welsh women in the village essentially telling them to shut up so she can enjoy the bingo. The irony, of course, being that there were and are plenty of issues that specifically affected women in the village and the queer community. A woman's group is portrayed as frivolous and divisive. Where is the call for solidarity there? It's the same argument that we see background characters make against the queer and mining communities helping each other. Why don't they stick to their own problems? We have enough to deal with here already. But the same understanding and compassion isn't extended to the women championing women's voices. The French movie 120 BPM is perhaps one of the most realistic depictions of queer activism, specifically AIDS activism, on screen, although this film isn't as much of an easy, heartwarming watch as Pride is. The first scene in the movie shows the leaders of ACT UP Paris giving a quick initiation to the newest members of the group. It also serves as the audience's initiation. From that moment, we're thrust into meetings, protests, and demonstrations. By the end of the film, you walk away with a real understanding of what ACT UP members did. They didn't just march and collect money. They created educational materials. They vandalized homophobic and misinformative books. They demanded results from medical trials be released earlier. They worked alongside research groups to create sustainable medical trials for AIDS medication. And unlike Pride or recent TV show It's a Sin, this movie depicts lesbian activists in a positive way. The character of Sophie, an activist who's shown to be in a relationship with another woman, is passionate and effective as an activist. Nobody ever brings up her sexuality or makes a cheap lesbian joke. In fact, the ACT UP group makes explicit points to represent lesbians as they raise awareness, hanging up posters depicting lesbian sex as part of their youth protection campaign. Including lesbians when we talk about AIDS activism, it's not just some woke inserting of these lesbian characters where they don't belong. Famously, groups of lesbian women banded together to support and tend to men dying from AIDS in hospitals. There's a quote from a man who remembers them at the time. Suddenly, the hospitals were full of lesbians who were volunteering to go into these rooms and help my friends who were dying. I remember being so moved by them because gay men hadn't been too kind to lesbians. We'd make fun of the butch dykes in the bars, and yet they were there. And it wasn't just their emotional and physical support that they lent to the cause, but also, quite literally, their blood. At a time when gay men weren't allowed to give blood, but HIV patients desperately needed it, there were lesbian blood drives so that they could supply it. One activist, Barbara Vick, and her partner established an account with a private blood bank, which allowed them to specify that they wanted their donations to go to those with HIV and AIDS. They were part of an organisation called the Blood Sisters that would regularly hold blood drives in the 1980s. And news of their work spread. There were drives all over the country, especially from lesbian groups, kind of using the slogan, helping our brothers fight the AIDS epidemic, or our boys need our blood. In 2016, Barbara Vick gave an interview where she talked about the idea that at the time, I don't think women economically had as much to give as men, but this was something that they could do, the giving of themselves. Heart blood is such a basic thing. 120 BPM depicts activists as gay men, lesbians, trans women, haemophiliacs, and the families and friends of HIV-positive people. It's an ensemble film and everyone in that ensemble passionately disagrees with each other. There are debates about whether handcuffing constitutes a non-violent demonstration, whether it serves the purpose of ACT UP to call for jailing a politician, whether or not to meet with a certain government agency. Are cheerleading outfits during Pride too campy? Everyone is in constant conversation and debate with each other. And yet this isn't a story about activists eating their young. They get stuff done because they're united by a shared goal. But 120 BPM never portrays its activists as a monolith. Intersectionality. I think at this point it's important to talk about one of the side effects of this image of activists as single-minded, obsessive and obnoxious, and that is a failure to acknowledge activists who experience multiple marginalizations or identities. This is then compounded by the comparative lack of diversity across the history of film and TV, saving queer characters for very special episodes, or relegating blackness to specific historic traumas, leaving little room to explore the totality of a person, for example. When you only have a 2-hour runtime to introduce an audience to a character alongside a potentially complex socio-political issue, many filmmakers seem to see anything that branches out from a narrow focus as a distraction. Take the movie Suffragette, for example, about the fight for women's rights to vote in the UK. Real-life suffragettes at the time included women of colour and plenty of queer women, including in the highest organiser ranks. But the movie itself focuses specifically on the fight of straight white women. There is this idea that intersections would muddle the message. We also see real-world bias affect the portrayal of historical events. The movie Stonewall is a notorious example of this. The film has become known by many in the queer community primarily because of its choice to centre a cis white gay man in a story that had been a rallying point to celebrate the contributions of trans women of colour to our history. The question who threw the first brick at Stonewall has devolved into a meme at this point, but the filmmaker choosing to show that act of rebellion on screen coming from the hands of a fictional white cis protagonist, it crystallized on film an answer to the question with their own simplified narrative. And this type of erasure isn't just an issue from the point of view of representation, it actively undermines the importance of solidarity in meaningful activism. Issues of inequality, of marginalization and criminality are linked across communities, not just because of the none of us are free until all of us are free sentiment, but because there are people who are literally living lives affected by multiple issues. There are queer activists who also fight for Black liberation and disability rights, for example. Not just people who can see that those things are linked, but also people who belong to all three of those communities. Of course, we don't expect all stories that focus on one aspect of activism to somehow include them all, but when these connections are ignored or whitewashed, it feels pointed. It sticks out. And then there's the stories that don't stick out because they're absent entirely, partly because of the narrowed focus of previous dramatizations of the issues involved. These real-life people sort of get erased from their own history. Selma, for example, is a historic drama focusing on the work of Martin Luther King Jr. during the 1965 voting rights marches. The movie gained critical success, including a nomination for Best Picture at the Oscars, and tells the story of the major figures involved in the marches. But some have pointed out a glaring omission, an activist who was vital to organising the marches, as well as the media attention to the brutality that they were met with. One article pointed out, Rustin is the one pivotal player whose name is never spoken at any point during the film's 127 minutes. His position as an openly gay man led to his place in the Black civil rights movement being restricted to a behind-the-scenes organisational role. The chairman of the NAACP at the time didn't want his pivotal involvement in organising the march to be known, saying, "This march is of such importance that we must not put a person of his liabilities at its head." Rustin was a complex figure, working across justice movements for much of his life, seeing a tie between them, including Black rights, workers' rights, healthcare rights, and gay rights, leading some to question his omission from the story of Selma. Was the idea of an activist who was both Black and gay introducing too much to the narrative? This isn't necessarily a criticism of Selma, the individual movie. It's a very good movie, but it is potentially indicative of the way that these movements are separated in our minds, which leaves many portrayals of those with intersecting marginalizations to be relegated to exaggerated hypotheticals. What's next? A character who's Black and gay and working class? As if that person doesn't already exist. Interestingly, there is an upcoming film being made about his life, and I personally hope it's the first of many films depicting real-life activists whose stories have been ignored because they were too Black, too gay, too gender non-conforming, too anti-capitalist, often all of those at the same time. I'd love to see the stories of James Baldwin, Audre Lorde, William Dorsey Swann, Mabel Hampton on screen. It feels like you can't glance at the comment section of a movie or TV trailer with a diverse cast nowadays and not see at least one mention of the slogan, "Get woke, go broke." And that's not even stories with like activism at its center. It's just like there's a black character in a fantasy movie or a woman in a reboot. It feels like there are always going to be people who are overly critical of the portrayal of any kind of modern activism. But I don't think that that's a reason for us to stop doing it. I think the best portrayals of activism are the ones that feel honest, authentic. They aren't these exaggerated, comedic, woke portrayals, but they're also not these cookie cutter ideas of the perfect activist either. Portrayals of multiple activists within the same piece of media where they aren't being played off against each other to suggest like a good activist versus a bad activist, but instead acknowledge the fact that, you know, people are not a monolith. They can have different opinions, there can be different things that work in different circumstances, and that those discussions can be extremely fruitful. In fact, they are in real life activist circles. As I've already said, I would love to see in the future portrayals of these historical figures who really haven't had their due, who have kind of not had their time in the spotlight and that a lot of people don't know about. But I would also love to see more portrayals of what activism looks like right now. Everyone knows the idea of like what activism is in a very generic way, but I often get young people talk to me when I do events or in the comments on my videos about like, how do you become an activist? What does it even involve? Like, I want to help change things, but I have no idea how to go about it. And I feel like a lot of that is due to the fact that it's not something that would ever be taught in schools, but also because if most of the representation available to you is either, you know, these people who lived decades ago and were fighting for totally different causes, or these exaggerated, woke, comedic characters that you just find very cringeworthy, I can understand how that is a question that you wouldn't know the answer to. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments, maybe some examples of activism on screen that you think was particularly good, or I guess particularly bad. As always, if you would like to help support me make videos like this one, I will leave a link to my Patreon in the description. And I would like to just say a thanks once more to today's sponsor ThreadUp. Don't forget that you can get 30% off your first order and free shipping with the code ROWAN.